the letters my mother left in the old church pew, and I still remember the exact moment the warped oak grain of the third pew from the back gave way beneath my fingertips, sliding open a hidden compartment that had remained completely undisturbed since the bitter winter of 1994. My name is Lucas Harper, and like my father and grandfather before me, I grew up believing our family's history in Ashwood, Pennsylvania, was as open and predictable as the rolling cornfields surrounding the valley. After spending 12 years away in Chicago managing high-rise commercial real estate developments, a fast-paced corporate life that left my bank account full and my spirit entirely hollowed out, I had returned home following my father's debilitating stroke. I expected a long, quiet season of sterile hospital corridors, physical therapy schedules, and the tedious burden of sorting through decades of accumulated tools and farming equipment in our drafty ancestral farmhouse. I certainly did not expect to find a bundle of heavy linen envelopes hidden inside the sacred timber of Street Luke's Episcopal Church, addressed not to my grieving father, but to the town's fiercely respected retired sheriff, bearing a faded return address from a cloistered Catholic convent in West Philadelphia that my mother had supposedly never visited in her entire life. The morning sun was cutting long, amber blades across the empty, dust-moated sanctuary, when I carefully slid the first envelope free, breaking a seal of hardened red wax that still carried the faint, lingering scent of dried lavender and old parchment. Outside the stained glass windows, the heavy bronze bell of St. Luke's began to toll for the 9 o'clock service, its deep, resonant vibrations shaking the floorboards beneath my boots, completely unaware that the fragile peace of every prominent family in Ashwood was about to crack wide open. I sat down hard on the splintered edge of the bench, the heavy silence of the empty church pressing down on my shoulders as the final echo of the bell faded into the vaulted ceiling. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. My mother, Sarah Harper, had passed away when I was only 8 years old, a loss that had cast a long, permanent shadow over my childhood. In the years following her death, my father had retreated into himself, burying his grief beneath endless hours of tending to fields and repairing machinery, never speaking her name unless it was strictly necessary. To me, she had always been an angelic, untouchable memory, a soft-spoken woman who loved gardening, sang hymns in this very choir loft, and supposedly died of a quiet, lingering illness in the county hospital. But the letter I now held in my hand, dated November 14th, 1994, just 3 months before she supposedly passed away, told a completely different story. I unfolded the heavy stationery, my eyes scanning the cramped, hurried handwriting that looked nothing like her usual neat cursive. Arthur. The letter began, addressing the retired sheriff by his first name rather than his title. If you are reading this, it means I didn't make it to the train. Edward found out about the deed transfers from the county clerk's office. He thinks I'm running away with jewelry or cash, but he has no idea what is actually buried beneath the foundation of the old grain silo. If anything happens to me, look after Lucas. Do not let him inherit the farm until he turns 30. The land isn't ours, Arthur. It never was. I stopped breathing. My eyes scanned the words over and over again, each line tearing another piece out of the idealized childhood memory I had spent a lifetime holding on to. My father, hard-working, stoic, salt-of-the-earth Edward Harper, wasn't just a grieving widower. According to my mother's own desperate words, he had hunted her down, and the farm where I learned to ride a bike and drive a tractor was built on a foundation of stolen land and hidden terror. Before I could process the full weight of the revelation, a heavy footstep echoed sharply from the stone entryway at the back of the sanctuary, followed by a familiar, gravelly voice calling out into the empty pews. "Lucas, are you in here, son? The nurse at the home said you left your phone in the truck." It was Sheriff Arthur Miller himself, now retired, but still carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had ruled Ashwood's laws for 40 years. And he was walking straight down the center aisle toward the third pew from the back. I shoved the letter back into its heavy linen envelope with a frantic motion, my fingers fumbling against the rough paper as I slid the entire bundle deep into the inside pocket of my wool coat. The footsteps grew closer, the rhythmic, heavy thud of rubber-soled boots and the distinct tap of a wooden walking stick, striking the polished stone floor echoing off the high cedar rafters of the sanctuary. "Lucas," Arthur Miller called out again, his voice carrying that familiar, Commanding warmth I had known since I was a boy running down Main Street with scraped knees. Your truck's hazard lights were blinking out in the lot. Thought, maybe you had a flat tire or worse. I stood up slowly from the third pew, my knees feeling uncomfortably weak, and stepped out into the center aisle just as a retired sheriff came to a halt beneath the soft, colored light of the rose window. Arthur was older now, his silver hair cropped short, wearing a heavy flannel shirt and a canvas jacket, leaning slightly on an Ashwood cane, but his eyes, sharp gray and intensely observant, missed nothing. They swept over my face, noting the paleness of my skin and the hurried way I was buttoning my coat over my bulging pocket. "No flat tire, Arthur," I managed to say, forcing a tight, unnatural smile onto my face as I walked toward him. "Just came in to sit for a minute. It's been a long week with my dad at the facility." Arthur's gaze lingered on me for a fraction of a second longer than comfort. Aloud, he gave a slow, understanding nod, though his expression remained heavy, with a secret gravity. "Your father's stroke took a lot out of him, boy, but Edward Harper was never a man to let go of things easily," Arthur said quietly, turning his head to look back toward the altar before looking back down at me. "Some men carry burdens so long they forget what it feels like to stand up straight. Your mother was much the same toward the end." My blood ran cold. I froze mid-step, my hand involuntarily pressing against the pocket where the letters rested against my ribs. "What do you mean, Arthur?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave, losing its forced casualness. "What do you know about my mother's final months?" Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised or defensive. He simply let out a long, slow breath that smelled faintly of peppermint and winter air, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an unyielding, melancholic depth. "I mean Lucas, that I've kept a locked box in my basement for 30 years with. Your mother's name on it," Arthur said softly, his voice echoing off the empty wooden pews. "And I've been waiting for the day you finally came back to Ashwood, smart enough to open it." The silence in the sanctuary grew heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the church's ancient radiator heating system somewhere beneath the floorboards. I stared at the old sheriff, my mind racing through a maze of confusion and rising dread. "A locked box," I repeated, the words tasting like dry ash in my mouth. "You've had a box of my mother's things this entire time, while my father let me grow up believing she just faded away in a hospital bed." Arthur lowered his head slightly, leaning a bit heavier on his Ashwood cane, as if the weight of the past decades had suddenly settled entirely onto his shoulders. "Your father didn't want you to know, Lucas. And back then, as the sheriff of this town, I had to balance the piece of Ashwood against the raw truth of what happened behind closed doors at the Harper farm. Edward was a powerful man when the county was expanding, and had a terrifying way of making people who cross him simply disappear from the town records." "Disappear?" My voice rose, bouncing sharply off the stained glass windows. "She was his wife. Are you telling me my father drove her away? Or worse?" "I'm telling you that your mother wasn't running away because she stopped loving you, Lucas," Arthur said, his gray eyes piercing straight through me with an intensity that demanded absolute attention. "She was running because she found out what your grandfather hid under the grain silo in 1985. The same secret the town council, the bank, and your father had been protecting with silence ever since." Before I could demand, he explained what was buried beneath our farmland. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung wide open with a loud, echoing crash. Bright midday sunlight flooded the dim sanctuary, silhouetting a tall, sharply dressed man standing in the doorway. Even against the blinding light, I recognized the sharp posture, the expensive charcoal overcoat, and the cold, calculated demeanor of Thomas Henderson, the current president of the Ashwood Savings and Trust, and the son of a man who had controlled the town's mortgages for half a century. Well, Henderson's smooth, aristocratic voice carried effortlessly up the center aisle. The retired lawman and the prodigal real estate developer huddled together in a house of God. "I suppose you're discussing the Harper farm estate, Lucas? Because if you are, you should know the bank filed an emergency foreclosure on the property an hour ago. And according to the county registry, that land doesn't belong to your family anymore. I spun around, my boots scraping against the polished stone floor as Thomas Henderson strode down the center aisle, his polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone. He didn't look like a local banker dropping by to offer condolences. He looked like a corporate predator moving in for the final kill. Foreclosure? I stepped out from the pew, my anger instantly flaring up, burning away the shock of Arthur's revelation. On what grounds, Henderson? The farm has been in my family for 3 generations. The mortgage was paid off before I was old enough to drive a tractor. Henderson stopped 10 feet away, offering a cool, perfectly rehearsed corporate smile that didn't reach his eyes. He slipped his hands into the pockets of his expensive charcoal overcoat, glancing briefly at Sheriff Arthur Miller, before turning his full, patronizing attention back to me. Mortgages can be settled, Lucas, but municipal back taxes and environmental liens are an entirely different matter, Henderson replied smoothly, his voice echoing comfortably off the wooden rafters. When your father suffered a stroke last week, the county health inspector reviewed the old agricultural zoning permits on the western acreage, specifically the land surrounding the old grain silo. It turns out the soil contamination from 1985 violates state environmental codes. The bank had to step in to protect the county from liability. The property reverted to municipal receivership this morning. I clenched my fists so hard my fingernails bit deep into my palms. The grain silo, the exact same spot my mother had mentioned in her letter tucked inside the church pew just moments ago. It wasn't about back taxes or environmental codes. Henderson was hunting for whatever my grandfather had buried out there 40 years ago, and he was using the bank's legal machinery to strip the land away from me before I could find it. You're lying, I said, taking a sharp step toward him. You don't give a damn about soil contamination. Henderson, you want what's buried under the silo. Henderson's polite smile didn't waver, but a cold, hard glint flickered in his eyes. You've been away in Chicago too long, Lucas. Out here in Ashwood, reality isn't shaped by what you feel. It's shaped by who holds the deeds. And right now, the bank holds every single key to your family's history. Before I could lunge forward and wipe that corporate smirk off his face, Sheriff Arthur Miller raised his Ashwood cane, bringing it down against the stone floor with a sharp, commanding crack that echoed like a gunshot through the empty church. Hold your tongue, Thomas, and watch your step, the old sheriff growled, stepping between us with a sudden, formidable display of his old authority. You might own the bank, and you might have bought off half the county commissioners, but you are standing in a house of God, and you are talking to the legal heir of Edward Harper. If you think you can walk onto that farm and start digging up what's buried under the silo without a federal warrant, you've forgotten who still holds the duplicate keys to the county archives. Henderson's eyes narrowed, the polite mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal a flash of genuine panic. He looked from Arthur to me, realizing that the old lawman wasn't just reminiscing in an empty church. He was arming me for a war. Keep the letters, Lucas, Henderson said coldly, turning on his heel and heading back down the aisle toward the bright sunlight of the open doorway. You'll need them to prove who you were when the sheriff isn't around to protect you. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, plunging the sanctuary back into a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked at Arthur, my chest heaving, the folded linen letters burning against my ribs. All right, Arthur, I said, my voice dead serious. No more games. We're going to your basement. You're going to open that lockbox, and you're going to tell me what my grandfather buried under the silo before Henderson bulldozes the entire farm. Arthur didn't hesitate. He gave a single, firm nod, turned his body toward the side exit of the sanctuary, and led me out through the narrow vestry door into the biting, gray autumn air. We didn't take my truck. Instead, we climbed into his battered forest green pickup truck parked behind the church parish hall, the old V8 engine coughing twice before roaring to life with a cloud of white exhaust. The drive out to Arthur's house on the ridge took less than 10 minutes, but every second felt stretched to a breaking point as the familiar, rolling hills of Ashwood slid past the frost-covered windshield. The Harper farm sat 2 miles further down the valley, its weathered red barn and towering white grain silo visible like a skeleton against the bruised afternoon sky. Arthur's house was a modest, single-story brick cottage surrounded by towering pine trees that blocked the wind. He killed the engine, and we walked in silence up the wooden ramp to his front door. Inside, the house smelled of old books, wood smoke, and simmering chicken broth. It was a lonely home, neat to a fault, reflecting a man who had spent a lifetime guarding secrets that nobody else wanted to carry. Without taking off his canvas jacket, Arthur walked straight down the narrow hallway to the back of the house, pulled a small brass key from a chain around his neck, and unlocked the heavy basement door. The stairs creaked beneath our weight as we descended into the dim, cedar-paneled cellar. Unlike my father's cluttered, chaotic workshop filled with tractor parts and fertilizer bags, Arthur's basement was meticulously organized. Rows of metal filing cabinets lined the back wall, each one labeled with faded masking tape and black marker dates from the 1970s and 80s. Arthur walked past the cabinet straight to a heavy iron safe bolted into the concrete foundation in the far corner. He spun the combination dial with precise, practiced movements, left to 42, right to 18, left to 7, and pulled the heavy steel door open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. Inside sat a single dust-covered wooden box secured with a brass padlock. Arthur pulled it out, placed it gently on a scarred wooden workbench beneath a single overhead drop light, and looked up at me with grave, unblinking eyes. Your grandfather, Thomas Harper first, wasn't a farmer when he first came to Ashwood in 1950. Arthur said softly, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. He was a surveyor for the State Water Board, and the land your family farm sits on was never purchased legally. It was acquired through a forced displacement of 40 families during construction of the Valley Reservoir, a displacement your grandfather orchestrated and covered up with the help of Thomas Henderson's father. My breath caught my throat. I stared at the wooden box on the workbench, realizing that every acre of corn and wheat I had run across as a boy was stained with historic crime. "Open it, Lucas," Arthur said, sliding a small brass key across the scar which tore my hand. "The truth about your mother, and the truth about what's buried under the silo is right inside." I picked up the small brass key, its metal cold and heavy against my palm, and slid it into the lock of the dust-covered wooden box. It turned with a crisp, muffled click. I lifted the lid, releasing a dense cloud of stale air that smelled of dried ink, old wool, and forgotten time. Inside lay a thick stack of legal documents tied with faded pink ribbon, a handful of black and white photographs, and a small leather-bound journal with my mother's initials, S.H., stamped in gold leaf on the cover. I reached past the documents and pulled the journal free, my fingers trembling slightly as I opened to the first page. "Read the entry from February 3rd, 1995, Arthur murmured, leaning against the edge of the workbench, staring into the dark corner of the cellar. That was the week before she vanished. I flipped the brittle pages, scanning the hurried, emotional handwriting until my eyes locked onto the date. Edward found the secondary ledger in the wall of the root cellar today. My mother had written. He didn't yell. That's what terrifies me the most. He just looked at me and said if I ever spoke a word to the state investigators about the reservoir displacement funds, he would make sure Lucas never saw me walk out of this house alive. Henderson's bank is laundering the remaining trust payouts through the grain silo construction account. I'm going to Arthur tonight. I have to give him the copies before Edward realizes they're missing from the desk drawer. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My mother hadn't died of a lingering illness. She hadn't run away out of coldness or abandonment. She had been trapped, silenced, and driven into terror by the man who raised me, all to protect a criminal enterprise built on stolen land and fraudulent municipal funds. She never made it in my house that night, Lucas, Arthur said, his voice cracking with deep, long-buried grief. Your father intercepted her on the gravel road by the south pasture. By the time I drove out to farm to check on her, Edward had already cleaned out her room, burned her personal effects in the backyard barrel, and told the entire town she had checked herself into a psychiatric facility down in Philadelphia and didn't want to be contacted. I knew he was lying, but without the ledger, without proof, the county prosecutor wouldn't sign a search warrant against a respected landowner like Edward Harper. I looked up from the journal, my eyes burning with a hot, blinding rage that completely pushed aside the grief. I looked at the old sheriff, then down at the remaining documents in the wooden box. Specifically, a detailed architectural cross-section of the Ashwood grain silo. dated 1952, showing a secondary subterranean vault built directly beneath the main concrete foundation. The ledger isn't just a record of stolen land, I said, a dangerous, absolute clarity taking hold of my mind. It's the master account book for every bribe Henderson's family paid to the county commissioners for the last 40 years. And your father kept it hidden right beneath the grain silo where nobody would ever dare dig, Arthur added grimly. I closed the journal, picked up the architectural map, and slipped it safely into the inside pocket of my coat alongside my mother's letters from the church pew. Henderson filed a foreclosure on the farm this morning under the guise of environmental contamination, I said, my voice hardening into steel. He thinks he's moving in to sanitize the property and destroy whatever is left down there. And what are you going to do about it? Arthur asked, straightening up from the workbench, his gray eyes catching the harsh droplight. You're standing up against the bank, the county court, and your own father's legacy. It's a war you can't win with legal paperwork alone. I'm not going to fight them with paperwork, Arthur, I said, turning toward the basement stairs. I'm going to open up that silo myself, and I'm going to invite the entire town of Ashwood to watch what falls out. The autumn wind howled across the open valley as I drove Arthur's battered forest green truck up the gravel lane of the Harper farm. The sprawling property looked just as it always had. The weather-red barn, the decaying white farmhouse with its drawn curtains, and towering over everything else, the massive, cylindrical concrete silhouette of the old grain silo standing against the gray evening sky. I didn't park by the house. Instead, I drove the truck straight around to the back, cutting across the frostbitten corn stubble until the front bumper touched the rusted metal ladder of the silo base. Sitting right beside the reinforced concrete access door was a sleek, late-model black SUV with state capital license plates. Thomas Henderson's vehicle. I killed the engine, climbed out of the truck, and slammed the door shut with a heavy, echoing bang that startled a flock of crows from a nearby fence line. The wind bit sharply at my face, but I didn't feel the cold. My blood was running hot with a focused, relentless anger. As I walked toward the base of the silo, the heavy steel access door creaked open, and Thomas Henderson stepped out into the twilight, holding a heavy-duty industrial flashlight in one hand and a thick manila folder in the other. He wasn't alone. Two burly men in heavy construction jackets, men I recognized as local contractors who moonlighted for the County Public Works Department, stood just behind him inside the dark, cavernous interior of the structure. Henderson stopped, flashing that cold, practiced corporate smile as he adjusted the collar of his expensive wool overcoat. Well, Lucas, Henderson called out over the howling wind, his voice dripping with condescension. I must admit, I didn't expect you to show up here alone. Most men would take the bank's severance offer and catch the next train back to Chicago. I kept walking, closing the distance between us until I was standing just 10 feet from the threshold of the silo, my hands buried deep inside the pockets of my wool coat, gripping the architectural map and my mother's journal. You're trespassing, Henderson, I said, my voice cutting sharply through the wind. The foreclosure filing hasn't even cleared the county desk yet. What are you and your municipal thugs doing inside my family's grain storage? Henderson's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed with a cold, predatory gleam. He stepped slightly to the side, gesturing with his flashlight toward the open interior behind him. Your family's grain storage hasn't held wheat or corn since 1985, Lucas, Henderson said smoothly. And as for trespassing, look around. The County Health Board condemned this parcel an hour ago due to hazardous subterranean leakage. We aren't trespassing. We're executing an emergency environmental remediation on behalf of the public trust. Remediation? I scoffed, taking another step forward. Is that what you call tearing up the concrete floor to find the 1950 Surveyor vault? You aren't looking for toxic waste, Henderson. You're looking for the master account book that proves your family bought the county commissioners with stolen reservoir funds. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. A sharp, ugly tension tightened the muscles around Henderson's jaw, and the two construction workers behind him shifted their weight uneasily, exchanging quick, nervous glances. You have no idea what you're dealing with, boy, Henderson hissed, dropping the corporate pleasantries as he stepped up to the threshold, blocking the entrance to the silo. That vault contains papers that will shatter the economy of this entire county. Your father understood that. He kept his mouth shut for 40 years, protected his land, and let the past stay buried. Why can't you do the same? Because my mother didn't, I said, pulling the leather-bound journal and the architectural map out of my pocket and letting them catch the harsh beam of the industrial flashlight. And because her ghost is done hiding in your church pews. Henderson's eyes locked onto the journal in my hand, and a look of cold, calculated malice washed over his face. He nodded slowly to the two men behind him. Get him off the property, Henderson ordered quietly. Dump his truck down the quarry road, and make sure he understands that some doors are never meant to be opened. The two construction workers didn't hesitate. They stepped out of the dark, cavernous interior of the silo, their heavy boots crunching against the frozen gravel, broad shoulders squared and hands raised in a clear threat. Don't do it, boys. A deep, gravelly voice echoed across the frozen corn stubble from behind me. We all froze. Headlights cut sharply through the gathering dusk as Sheriff Arthur Miller's battered forest green truck careened around the corner of the barn, sliding to a violent, sideways stop right beside my vehicle, blocking any escape route back down the lane. The driver's door swung open before the tires had even stopped spinning, and Arthur stepped out into the biting wind. He wasn't leaning on his Ashwood cane anymore. In his right hand, held steady and pointed straight at the ground, was a nickel-plated Smith & Wesson service revolver that hadn't seen the light of day since his retirement, but gleamed with lethal authority under the amber twilight. "Game's over, Thomas," Arthur called out, his voice carrying decades of unyielding law enforcement weight across the open field. "Drop the flashlight, and tell your hired muscle to step back." The state police barracks in Harrisburg received copies of those ledgers 20 minutes ago via certified courier. There's a warrant signed by a federal judge sitting on your desk at the bank right now. Henderson's face drained of color, his corporate composure instantly shattering into jagged pieces of pure, unadulterated panic. He looked from Arthur's steady revolver to the closed door of his black SUV, realizing too late that his web of municipal control had completely collapsed. "You're bluffing, old man," Henderson choked out, his voice rising in pitch against the howling wind. "You can't prove a damn thing about the reservoir funds from 50 years ago." "I don't have to prove it, Thomas," Arthur replied, walking forward slowly, his boots crunching over the frozen ground. "The state investigators are already opening the county vault beneath the municipal building. Your grandfather's signature is right there on the original deposit slips." Henderson looked back at me, his eyes wide and venomous, realizing he had lost. With a muttered curse, he threw the industrial flashlight down onto the frozen gravel, shattering its lens in a burst of white sparks, and shoved past his own contractors toward his SUV. "Let him run, Arthur," I said, stepping past the sheriff and walking right up to the threshold of the grain silo, clutching my mother's journal and the architectural map in my hand. Running won't save him now. Arthur lowered the revolver slightly, keeping his eyes on Henderson's taillights as the black SUV spun its tires in the mud, careened down the gravel lane, and disappeared into gray Pennsylvania night. When the roar of the engine finally faded into the distance, the farm fell back into a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the whistling wind sweeping across the empty cornfields. I turned my flashlight on, stepped across the threshold of the old grain silo, and swept the bright beam across the damp concrete floor. Near the center of the structure, half covered by a rusted sheet of corrugated steel, lay a heavy, iron ring set flush into the concrete, the exact entry point of the secondary subterranean vault my grandfather had sealed back in 1950. I knelt down, rested my mother's journal safely on the cold concrete, and reached out with both hands to grab the iron ring. "You ready for this, Lucas?" Arthur asked quietly, walking up behind me and shining his own light down onto the floor. "My mother died trying to open this door, Arthur," I said, gripping the iron ring tightly, my muscles tensing as I prepared to pull back 40 years of buried history. "It's time, let the light in." I pulled back with all my weight, my boots braced against the damp concrete floor, the muscles of my back straining against decades of hardened silt and vacuum seal. With a sudden, deafening thunk that echoed like a gunshot through the hollow cylinder of the silo, the heavy iron plate broke free, lifting upward in a cloud of ancient dust and stale, subterranean air. I coughed, waving my hand to clear the haze, and shone my flashlight down into the dark abyss. A rusted steel ladder led down into a small, square concrete chamber about 10 feet below. In the center of the room sat a massive old-fashioned iron ledger safe, its brass dial untouched since the Eisenhower administration. Resting right on top of the safe was a small, water-damaged wooden box, the exact twin of the one Arthur had kept locked in his basement. "Go on down, Lucas," Arthur said softly, resting a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Your mother's work is waiting at the bottom." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the rungs of a steel ladder and climbed down into the vault, my boots hitting the dry concrete floor with a hollow echo. I walked straight to the iron safe, ignored the heavy combination dial, and picked up the water-damaged wooden box resting on top. The brass clasp was rusted through. I popped it open with my bare hands. Inside, protected by layers of heavy oilcloth, was a stack of clean, perfectly preserved documents. The true, unredacted land deeds of every family displaced during the 1950 Reservoir Project, complete with the signatures of the state commissioners Henderson's family had bribed. A signed affidavit from my mother detailing the exact night she was forced into silence, and tucked neatly beneath everything else, a small silver locket holding a tiny photograph of a smiling woman holding a baby boy. My reflection in the polished silver of the locket blurred as a single tear slipped down my cheek. My mother hadn't forgotten me. She had fought for me until her very last breath, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs in church pews and hidden vaults, so that one day her son would return to reclaim the truth. 3 months later, the Ashwood Valley looked entirely different under the warm glow of a late spring sun. The federal investigations into the Ashwood Savings and Trust had concluded with a total dismantling of the bank's corrupt leadership, sending Thomas Henderson and his co-conspirators to federal prison for financial racketeering and municipal fraud. The stolen lands were legally returned to the descendants of the original 40 families, and the Harper farm was officially incorporated as a historic agricultural trust, bearing my mother's name engraved on a bronze plaque mounted right by the front gate. I stood on the wraparound porch of the farmhouse, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the robins darting through the budding apple trees. My father was recovering slowly at a rehabilitation facility down the valley, silent, humbled, and finally facing a reckoning of his own conscience, but alive and capable of a quiet, honest conversation when the time was right. Arthur walked to the gravel path, his Ashwood cane tapping lightly against the stone steps, carrying a small, flat package wrapped in brown butcher paper. "Mail for you, Lucas," the old sheriff said with a faint smile, handing over the package as he settled into the rocking chair beside me. I took it, cutting the twine with my pocket knife. Inside was a single heavy sheet of parchment paper, a certified deed from the State Historical Commission, officially recognizing the grain silo vault and the church pew cache as a protected landmark of Pennsylvania history. And tucked behind the deed was a handwritten note from the convent in West Philadelphia, signed by an elderly nun who had been a close friend of my mother during her brief secret visits there in the winter of '94. "She never stopped loving you, Lucas," the note read. "She just knew you'd find your way home when the ground finally stopped shaking." I smiled, looking out over the rolling green cornfields that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, knowing that the earth beneath our feet was finally at peace.